our next lightning talk is from Emily Swanson. She is Director of Public Opinion at the Associated Press. Emily Swanson's work has helped shape how journalists discuss and analyze public opinion polling. Today, she will discuss how AP goes about calling elections. So I'll go ahead and pass it off to you, Emily.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for having me. So I want to talk to you today about our decision desk work and how that relates to the evolving role that AP and a small set of other media organizations that actually collect votes and declare winners in US elections play at a time when distrust in elections and the media is rampant. So AP has been involved in helping Americans know who won and lost elections for 176 years. When, as a 2-year-old news cooperative, it declared Zachary Taylor the winner of the 1848 presidential election. And a lot has changed since then, but one thing that hasn't changed is the important role that AP and this small set of other media organizations play that's unique among the world's democracies. That's because unlike in many other countries, elections here are still conducted in a decentralized way from the ground up. There's no national body, and in some cases, no state body that compiles election results and tells the country who won elections in real time. Even as a public used to instant gratification waits to know who their next president is, who's won the Senate, who's won the House, who's won their governorship, or state legislatures across the country. Instead, media organizations continue to play an important role in working with election officials and gathering election results tabulated at the local level by counties, towns, and parishes, and telling the world when we are certain who has won. But what has changed? For one thing, how we vote. 50 years ago, nearly all Americans voted in person on Election Day. But in 2024, more than 80 million had already cast their ballots by the time Election Day arrived. Since 2020, and particularly at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, how we vote has become increasingly politicized. And although as we already saw earlier, there was a little bit less of a divide in 2024 than in 2020, Democrats in 2024 remained more likely to vote by mail, and Republicans more likely to vote in person. So because of the way that many states count their votes, that means that even if all counties in a state have reported some of their results, big changes could still be coming if the votes that remain to count are mostly mail and could favor Democrats, or mostly in person and could shift things towards a Republican. It can also mean significant delays in counting votes. Many states have rules about when mail ballots can be processed, and in many cases, mail ballots must go through procedures to verify that the right person has voted and ensure that someone who's voted by mail hasn't already voted in person, or vice versa. Those things can pose serious challenges to trust in elections, because to anyone not deeply versed in elections research, which might not include many people in this room, but does include a whole lot of the American public, those shifts that sometimes takes place over days and weeks can be really difficult to understand. It's a situation in which misinformation is quick to fill the gaps. And that's sometimes because of bad actors, but sometimes because people simply don't understand what's happening in a really complex system with differing rules across many states. That's all coming at a time when trust in both media organizations and election officials is faltering. AP VoteCast, our survey of the American electorate, found that only 40% of voters were this year were very confident that votes would be counted accurately nationwide. And among those voting for Trump, that number stood at only 16%. I want to note, as a quick aside here, that stands in contrast slightly to what we saw earlier, partly because this was conducted before the election results were determined. There's also been a long-term decline in trust in the media, which has also been especially concentrated among Republicans. And that poses a tremendous challenge to both election officials and news organizations, and especially those news organizations that take on the challenge of collecting election results and declaring winners. It means that we no longer live in a world where we can simply tell people who won and ask them to trust us. Instead, it's essential for us to explain exactly what we do and don't know throughout the process, including exactly why we know who has won and sometimes why we don't know it yet. That process starts well before Election Day, when we provide detailed explainers on how each state is conducting its elections, what the processes are at each state, and what election officials will be doing, and what that has meant about vote counting in the past. We've also taken on the role of attempting to explain our own role in American elections before any votes are counted, as a way to build trust in our audience and let them know ahead of time what we'll be doing. For the last several cycles, AP has also taken on the task of explaining in text why we've declared a winner, not just how they won, but how we know that they won. And text is still an important part of the way that we explain what we know and why our audience should trust us. But we also know that for much of the audience for elections data, they consume that data in a way that looks like this. It's just a graphic, and that doesn't necessarily tell you very much about why we know that, in this case, Donald Trump has won Wisconsin. So at AP, we've worked this cycle to build some of that explanatory coverage directly into our elections results pages. So before any votes are counted, those pages this year included contextual information, that's at the top, that included details about when polls close, when votes will be reported, rules about voting before Election Day, what will be included in those first updates, and whether it's different from what might be included in later updates, and when the presidential election was called 4 years ago to help sort of set the stage for what people can expect to see this year. And those pages were also built so that in key battleground races, they could include short notes that could be updated to explain what was happening at any given time, what we were expecting to see, whether there were delays, whether we were waiting for a certain type of ballot, and then to provide the context to explain why we had, in fact, declared a winner that links through to those text stories that we did in the battleground states. So this is a process that will continue to evolve as we seek new ways to build trust in our audience. But we see expanding the reach of this explanatory content as a key piece of our evolving role in tabulating and declaring winners in US elections. And we think that work is essential as we seek to build and maintain trust in our decision desk work. Thank you.
Next, we have Jordan Wilkie, the regional democracy reporter for WITF Harrisburg in Pennsylvania. Wilkie reports on a variety of governance and political and election issues, focusing on accountability and transparency. Today, he will address his experience reporting on elections in one of the most scrutinized swing states in the country, and make the case for why local newsrooms are essential to coverage and election access. All right, Jordan.
All right, hi y'all. I hope you're tired of well put together presentations. So this is a continuation of Professor Stewart's last slide on how people know about how elections are run and how they're secured, and also a continuation on the work that AP is doing. We partnered with them for this slide. So this is really a focus on local news. I work for a public radio NPR affiliate in central Pennsylvania, and also with a local newspaper that serves one county. And then, of course, we have partnerships across the state. So functionally, how can local news operate as an elections resource to provide people with information about how elections work? Let's do a little 101 or remedial information about how disinformation cycles work and what the problems are. Elections are systems in which people need to get information. So how do they get that information? These days, they often turn to their computers. The problem is twofold. Problem number one is people are bad at finding information and acting on good information. Problem number two is, despite the highly polished presentations that our election directors so far have presented, not all elections offices are resourced enough to provide easily accessible good information. And when I say easily accessible, I also mean like they show up at the top of a search when someone searches something on Google, like elections offices aren't famous for having good SEO. So how do we, in part, solve this problem? Or let me get back to that. What happens when this problem is exploited? What happens when people have high interest in something, they're searching for it, they're finding bad information, something happens they don't like? Unfortunately, if you look at this gentleman's outfit, it's not terribly divorced from what happened in reality. I missed a slide. I had a slide of the shaman up there. So I heard someone whisper it. They recognized. So how can newsrooms step in and help solve this problem? Well, there's two things. Newsrooms offer sort of a passive reserve of information that can be shared across web. Broadcast looked differently on my slide. T was up there before, on social posts and on print. All of these things are also ways to proactively get information to people. So I've been covering elections administration since 2018 and have a pretty decent sense of what your election denier, election skeptic, whatever groups, what kind of narratives they like to latch onto. And so I made a list of, I think I had like 48 different stories of like, these are all the different possible things that people could possibly want to know about, and we can write them ahead of election day. So we got to about 19 of them. So we want to share this across local news outlets, but there are a ton of local news outlets across the state. How do we effectively provide information to all these different people across the state if all of us are doing something different? So this isn't about a single news outlet. This is about all the different news outlets playing together. And this is a symbol of the fact that we don't play together very well. So what did we do this election cycle? WATF, which is our public radio call sign, worked with the Associated Press to put together, these are 19 stories, examples of 19 of our stories that we ran, that are bite-sized chunks of basic information that we're providing to voters, and we're providing them usually around some sort of news hook. So the four that I want to highlight here are the coverage that we did of logic and accuracy testing, of hand counting, of chain of custody, and on backup plans for when things go wrong on election day. Those four stories were really important on election day when one of our counties, Cambria County, realized at 7:04 a.m. that none of their precincts were scanning their election day ballots. So the question is, what do? It's like, oh, well, they pivot to the backup plan that everyone has. So I was able to then cover what that backup plan was generally across the state, because people have pretty consistent backup plans, how they're going to maintain that chain of custody, how they are then going to count those ballots, because there's this hand counting process that they're going to go to. They didn't have enough, they weren't able to quickly enough print new ballots to then duplicate everything. And why did this happen in the first place? The logic and accuracy testing, they actually updated their file of printing the election day ballot after their LNA testing, and then didn't recheck that. Whoopsie-doos. So this is a map of all the different outlets that carried our coverage. The ones in green, so the AP worked with Knight Foundation to expand the number of outlets that could then run their content. The ones in green are the ones that weren't just normal subscribers to the AP. So this is about 30 outlets across the state. The place where you don't see a lot of coverage is where not a lot of people are. There are people living and voting there, but there's also some news deserts there. So this is sort of the reach that we're able to achieve. This is based on some basic Googling. So they ran at least one of our web stories, but we provided more than web. WATF being sort of the pilot organization, we provided linear broadcast, so that was on radio for us. And then we also had a website that had our elections hub. Every single story that we had on this, we had in one easy-to-find place. And then we have a podcast. So we streamlined our broadcast, goes into our podcast. The podcast segment goes into this playlist that was on all of our stories. The audio then gets put on our mobile app, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, Reddit, X, and all of that all those resources are shared with our public radio partners across the state and via AP. So one of the things that we did is when AP covered some of the stories, we covered some of the stories, but no matter who covered it, we always produced additional audio content to go with that. So the AP Wire ran both the web story and images and audio. So what's next? Elections are iterative, so we're going to do it again. If I know Pennsylvania at all, and I'm still learning, there's not going to be a lot of change in our election code before our municipal elections in 2025. So we can basically take these stories and reuse them. We might put a new little face on them, might do another short interview with an election official, get a new fresh quote, but it's going to be basically the same story, and we can just reuse this package over and over again, and hopefully through reuse, we create a habit of voters relearning how their votes are secured and how their elections are administered. I would love to study the impacts. So, a room full of academics. If anyone wants to help, I don't see Professor Stewart in here, so I'll have to chase him down individually. But I would like to study the impacts and know whether or not we are actually being effective, whether or not we're actually being helpful to elections officials, whether people are really taking up the content. And then I also want to think about replicating this across geography and topic. This is a focus on providing elections information, but if you take a little bit of a meta approach to it, this is a strategy providing news around a particular topic that is the center of a disinformation strategy over several years. How can we interrupt a disinformation cycle? And if you take another step back, how can local news outlets, which are highly trusted, work in a coordinated way to sort of take control over information narratives in a highly atomized information environment across outlet and medium? So I want to give credit to our digital producer, Jeremy Long, and our former intern and freelancer, Katie Knoll, for writing and sharing a number of these stories, and the Associated Press team. Katie Oyen is the Local News Success Initiative editor at the AP. Barbara Whitaker is the news verification editor. Josh Kelty did a bunch of the reporting, and Ron Vampel runs their audio team. And here's my contact information. So thank you.
Our next panel discussion will focus on the media perspective of covering elections, and particularly on how covering elections has changed over time. Our moderator for this panel is Pam Fessler, a former NPR news correspondent who has covered numerous topics, including voting and elections. Fessler worked as a journalist for 47 years, 28 of which was at NPR. Today, she is an advisor at the Elections Group, focusing on public communications on election issues. I think we all know and love Pam, so feel very grateful to have her here. Also on the panel is Kabir Khanna, who is Deputy Director of Elections and Data Analytics at CBS News. Brianna Lennon, who is co-host of High Turnout, Wide Margins, an election administration podcast in her free time, and also county election director in Boone County, Missouri. And then finally, we have Don Vaughan, who is Capitol Bureau Chief at the Raleigh News and Observer in North Carolina. So welcome to our panel.
Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. I think we should have gotten more applause than that. I don't know. yeah, that's it. All right. Anyway, I just want to thank everybody for Rachel for inviting us here to talk about this really important topic because, as most of you know, one of the keys to a successful election is a well-informed public. And it's not only, obviously, the election officials who are responsible for doing that, but it's also the media and working with the media. One thing I have to say is it is what happened in 2024 is night and day from when I first started covering the administration of elections over 20 years ago. What Jordan was describing, that just wouldn't have happened. That type of coordination, that type of focus by news organizations on what was going on and how our elections were run. Really not until 2020 did you start, I would cover a lot of these events and I'd be the only reporter there for many, many, many years. But starting in 2020, obviously, news organizations recognized that this was a very, very important topic and that it was very important that they cover it correctly. And since then, we've had a lot of efforts like the one that Jordan described. And so we're going to talk on the panel about what our journalists and our election official, have seen how things have changed, and then also how we can do things better. So I want to start out with you, Dawn. You've covered politics for a very long time, both in Virginia and North Carolina. So, and obviously this year in North Carolina, you had a lot of challenges covering how the election was being run. Not only the hurricane, but you also had a lot of changes in the way the laws, election laws. So how did you, how was it trying to explain this to the public? Were you getting the information you need? And how did that compare with maybe years before?
So North Carolina likes to make news a lot. As you just heard, our State Board of Elections Director, Karen Brunson-Bell, and it's ongoing. So a lot of what we do, so the News and Observer, we're the state capital paper in Raleigh. Our sister paper is the Charlotte Observer. We're McClatchy. And beyond what our state politics team does, and we have a DC correspondent too, is it's called service journalists that really write things in a way that explains things in a level that's maybe people who aren't into politics, but they have basic questions about wanting to vote. So the story, just an explainer, is a lot of what our newsroom did this election. And so it wasn't just politics and government reporters that wrote those explainer stories. And some are the things like, you all that work in state and county elections administration, that they have a very helpful website, explain everything in minute detail. That's great. Reporters love that, because then you can write something just like a Q&A. And because everything is about metrics and we collect data on what people are reading and know that if they're consuming this or not. And it's just like, how do I know when to vote and where and how and what happens next with my ballot? And do you have to fill out your whole ballot? You think maybe people would know you don't have to, not necessarily. So that's a lot of like the type of work that we've done in recent elections to think about the actual reader of the paper and what they might want to know. How things have changed. Again, dating myself, but I covered the 2000 election when I was just like a local cub reporter, where that was a long time ago, 24 years ago. And so I was working in southwestern Virginia. And you just go to the main county building, because it's just one county building. That's the courthouse and all the other offices. And you wait for them to bring the results out on a piece of paper and tape it to the wall. And you just sit on the floor, or chairs if you have them, outside of the elections office. And that's how we got results. And it was just technology-wise, a very different type of job. Of course, now we're all like refresh on the State Board of Elections website. And it's a very different vibe, because you're either in the newsroom doing that by the second. So if something doesn't go wrong, if a county is late, anything like that with a statewide race, it's high drama for that 5 minutes. And then of course we're out at candidate events and everything. The candidate events part doesn't change. That's it's the same type of thing. If you've been to any of those, a lot of excitement or a lot of sadness and a lot of waiting around in between, kind of like all elections.
So Kabir, one of the things I think that when I work with election officials and talk to election officials, one of their big concerns is how results are reported on elections, and that the public doesn't quite understand, say, what you do at CBS, using the data to make projections or to do stories. So can you explain? And also concerned that it might be misleading if people think, the election officials know they're still counting ballots,
Right.
So can you explain a little bit what you do, how you verify, that when you do use your data that you make for projections, that these are legitimate? And I think a little bit about what Emily was talking about. How do you get that message across to the public about what you are and don't know about these results?
Sure, thanks, Pam. And it's an honor to be at my first BPC Election Summit. I work at a somewhat specialized unit at CBS News. I manage a team of data scientists, survey researchers, and academics who are trying to make sense of the varied sources of data that we collect pre-election and on election night. We have a few goals. Let me start with maybe what we do pre-election. A lot of that is based on survey research and polling. We are basically trying to collect data not only to estimate public opinion and put out our best estimates of the horse race, which seems to be what everyone's demanding, but to also go beyond the horse race and explain the contours of key races, to explain the top issues that voters say they care about, which in turn we hope will help drive some of the coverage. And in addition to the polling, we're also using auxiliary sources of data more and more, and this connects to what we do on election night. But that includes things like US Census data, voter files to estimate the composition of the electorate, to forecast turnout, how many votes we expect in each jurisdiction. And increasingly, we're relying on precinct returns, both from historical results and on election night, to make more to explain granular shifts in the electorate that we're seeing. So I have also noticed an increase in data literacy. It seems like every cycle, both among journalists and among the public, and an ever greater appetite and demand for more and more granular data, for a wider breadth of data to explain what's going on in the electorate and what's going on election night. In addition, one of the roles we have pre-election is providing guidance internally to our journalism colleagues about polls and about expectations. And I noticed this year, there have been a lot of comparisons to 2020, we had a much easier task explaining to people what realistic expectations should be starting the morning of November 5th and then going onwards. We leaned heavily on guidance from election administrators around the country in states and counties, on basically how the elections are run, what are the rules around voting, how absentee ballots are processed and tabulated, the cadence of vote reports on election night. All of that information, that research, is crucial both for my team and for explaining to anchors, producers, executives, basically what's this going to look like. In fact, if I got any complaint this year, it's, why was this decided so quickly? You said it could take days. And 2020 was not the new normal. It was an anomaly in a lot of ways. So that's sort of the period, the few months leading up to Election Day. I'll spend a minute talking about maybe the data sources we look at on Election Day and how we make projections. A lot of this is similar to what Emily covered with the AP decision desk. The first thing we're looking at in terms of results or data sources that only become available that day is exit polling. So that's sending basically, it's a huge operation, but sending in-person interviewers to samples of precincts around the country and in key states to talk to people as they exit their polling place. As people have moved more and more to early voting, it includes components where we station interviewers at early vote centers in the weeks leading up to Election Day during the early vote windows. And it includes calling people who might have voted by mail. All of that data is merged together. We're looking at it on Election Day.
And just real quickly, I mean, is it just CBS collecting it, or do you do it as part of?
That's a great question. This is part of the National Election Pool, which is a consortium of major news networks. So I'm at CBS, there's NBC, ABC, and CNN, and this operation is run by Edison Research on behalf of the networks. The two other sources of data that are related are actually collecting vote tallies once voting at a precinct is complete. And then finally, the most important ingredient to do what we do, which is make projections, are county vote reports. Increasingly, we're making projections, and we do call it that instead of declaring winners. We're estimating where a race will land when all votes are counted. They're done via statistical models with human oversight, of course. Basically, the models are telling us when we should really pay attention to a race because it's getting close to a call status. They also rely heavily on knowing how many outstanding votes are left in a contest. And this, again, is where we interface with election administrators and officials and really rely on their guidance a lot of the time. We have models that tell us how many votes are likely in a county. But there's nothing better than getting kind of hard information on that, or if not a total number, when that might be known. Because I will say, increasingly, the pressure for my team is not just to make a projection, but to be very transparent. Emily alluded to this too. Very transparent about what we know and how we know it, and then also what we don't know. And we spend a lot of time on air talking about why a race where someone may seem to have a clear lead in the tabulated vote is not even close to a projection. It may depend on which counties have reported and which haven't, and may have to do with the types of votes that we've seen so far. Maybe it's mail-in absentee votes as opposed to election day votes. So increasingly, that's a big part of the job, as well as going beyond just winners and losers and telling people data-driven stories about the electorate, about their fellow citizens, about their neighbors. What are the shifts we're seeing, whether it has to do with demographic groups? What are the issues that people are really telling us they care about? I think we can get more into all of this, but I'll stop there.
Okay, that's great. And Brianna, you come at this from a different perspective. You're an election official. You've overseen elections. You've also done a lot of work, as many election officials, I think, have done in recent years, trying to improve communications with the public. I'm curious how you thought things went this year in terms of working with the media kind of getting the story right, getting that message across, as Kabir says, of what we know and what we don't know when it comes to projecting results. But also just to explain the process. Do you think things were better this year or not?
Yeah, I think, for one thing, I'm very lucky because we are fortunate to have the University of Missouri School of Journalism in my backyard. And so I have no shortage of students that need to crank out journalism. So we have a lot of really good explainers and things like that that have come out. But this is the first year that I've actually had one of our just local affiliates reach out to me and say, hey, we'd like to do some PSAs about how this process works.
This is the first time?
This is the first time that they have approached me to do it.
Right.
And so and they were extremely effective. And I think a really great model for how we finally could reach people, because they in-kinded that to the office. And being able to have a set 45-second piece about, we filmed them in our warehouse to show what the equipment was like. We talked about absentee voting. We talked about how the process worked, and we recruited poll workers that way. And everyone that came through, we had 1,500 people a day coming through our office to vote, no excuse absentee. There was, any time that I went downstairs, people would stop me and say, hey, we saw your commercial. Hey, that was really great. So it was reaching people, and it wasn't our idea. It came organically from our local news media. And I think that has really shown the evolution of how we've been working to have those communications, but also the recognition on the side of news and journalism that there is a benefit to doing that it's not just, me trying to chase them around and saying, hey, can you put this information out because I think it'll help our office. They saw that it benefited voters. They saw that it helped kind of bridge that gap of knowledge that, behind the scenes, we're working on all these elections things. I can put out as many press releases as I want, but they have to really drive the conversation. And so that's what I saw so much differently from 2020, 2022, is that our local news media was willing to kind of drive it instead of me chasing them. But I also think that there was more interest in the process than there had been in the past. And whether that filtered down from what national news was looking at, or whether people were just looking at it more because they had more questions and more skeptical, because we have seen more skeptics growing in the state of Missouri. I think there's just been a new normal for, these students come to our office because now the expectation is that they are covering this. It used to be kind of a one-off, I just have an interest in politics. We had people that were applying to be interns. On the journalism side, we had more social media interest of people that wanted to kind of put out information, and it wasn't just the, hey, make sure you vote, hey, get out and vote. It was, hey, this is how this process works. So I think there's just a lot more collaboration that's happening at all levels.
And you said you felt like it was pretty effective, and I'm curious, did you get any sense whether it addressed some of this election? You also said that election skepticism has increased, or is increasing in the state. So do you think it addressed some of that? Did you think that some of the people who are skeptical about the process, that this type of coverage helped ease their questions?
So I wish I could say yes. I think, although by and large for the average voter, I think it made for a much more positive election experience. I think we had a lot of people that were really appreciative that they could find information easily and get that information pretty quick. But on the flip side, and I had one of these individuals in my office on election night as we were reporting, and so they knew that we had only released our first round of results, and every race at the state of Missouri level had been called already. And so they were extremely upset that everything had been called while we still hadn't released results. And it actually sowed more doubt into their minds because they didn't understand why, when we had at least 80,000 votes to report out of our county, every race could have already been called. All the way down to the congressional level.
And was called by the media.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. Right. So I think that is still something that we struggle with, because at the election administrator level, it's very hard, I think, to explain to people, like, yes, we're still counting these votes, and they're working off statistical models, and yes, those are accurate statistical models, and I don't think that when we release our results, they're going to change. But it also then starts sowing the seed of, well, then why are we even doing this? This is pretty irrelevant if you can already call every race in the state of Missouri and you don't even need our votes. So I think that that's really difficult and does, I mean, for them at least, it kind of buoyed the lack of confidence they had already to see that happen.
There's a lot of race calls early. Like the News and Observer McClatchy, our standard is to use Associated Press race call.
Right.
And if we're writing it, it's, leading at this point, even as you're waiting for the final results to come in. And it's very important to use that, and we put it in the lead of all our election stories, according to unofficial results. And not everyone will realize that because, there's the social media, I've seen enough, I'm calling it. But, there's more to it, and it's not official yet, as you all know.
Right. And there was a big push, at least within the election community and within news organizations this year, to try and make that as clear as possible to people, just so they didn't have that concern. But I guess not everybody heard that message, which gets to my second question. And that is, one of the big trends that we've been seeing is that people are not getting their news from mainstream news organizations or from the sources that they're getting from many different sources, increasingly from social media. So, as we look forward to how do we continue to explain to people how elections are working so that they can feel confident in the results, you have to sort of explore new avenues of communicating. And I know that both you and Brianna have podcasts. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious how that's working. Do you think it's reaching people? Mm-hmm. And does the News and Observer have other plans for other ways to reach people in the future?
Yeah, I mean, you have to reach people where they are. And some people like, reading a long story, online because they go to the news organization's website and click from there. Or they follow it on social media and go from there. Or maybe they're less of a reader and more of a listener, which is where podcasts come in play. And our podcast, it's called Under the Dome. We've had it for a long time, kind of different formats, but it's about 20 minutes. It comes out every Monday morning, and I'm the host along with others on our politics team or other reporters. Sometimes I have lawmakers or other guests, and it's just kind of a faster way of getting like, this is what you need to know. Sometimes it's about an issue. Sometimes it's just whatever the main thing that's going on at the legislature at the time. And I've met people who were listeners who I thought it would be this very like govy type of listener, or people that like politics overall, but it's someone who wants their statewide news they need to be aware of in 20 minutes, about 22 minutes, which is the time that's the average commute for a lot of people. So I'll hear that they listen to it Monday morning on the way to work, or if they're coming in for the legislative session in Raleigh and their drive, lawmakers or staff or people listen to it that way, and that's their preference. So that's how we can get it out. And if it drives them to read our stories at the website, that's great. We still have a print edition for people that like that. But the social media is you go where the people are, and that's everything from I'm a big fan of Blue Sky already. Twitter X, as long as that's still on the tracks, I guess. And then Threads, Instagram, TikTok. We did. Others did, in our newsroom, did these election explainers on a TikTok video, because that's how somebody wants to get it. And it's still all the news. So when someone says they get their news from social media, it doesn't mean they're not getting it from a news organization or news organization affiliates. It's just their preferred method of it. And you really have to just adapt with how people consume things differently.
How about at CBS? I mean, are you... to get this message across about what you're doing and what your reporting is focused on.
Yeah.
Doing anything different than?
Yeah, I mean, it's been an evolution for sure. We're active in some of these same spaces. CBS has a host of podcasts. The Takeout is one that often delves deep into how elections are administered and how races are projected. I was recruited to do TikTok and Instagram videos in the lead up, something that I'm not used to doing professionally. But I agree, you have to meet people where they are. And the content itself also has to be compelling and illuminating. And so we do our best. It's a challenging issue, the one you mentioned earlier about races being projected while people feel like, well, what about my vote? And it's tough because we're trying to disseminate timely, accurate information, information that people would be trying to suss out if professional journalists weren't. So I do think it's important work. What I try to explain to people is that, unlike forecasters, we're not trying to predict the future. Sometimes a complaint I get is, well, why don't you just let voters vote? And I have to explain that we do. In fact, at CBS, until everyone's done voting, the polls have closed and everyone's cast a ballot, we don't even characterize a race. Like we won't even say, which way we think it's leaning. And certainly the projection won't come until quite a while later in most places. And really what it's more akin to than predicting what people will do, because everyone's already acted, it's a missing data puzzle. And there are quirks, and when a race might get projected is sometimes due to artifacts of the sequencing of county vote reports. Which ones come in first, which types of reports come in before others. And so that's a big part of what I try to tell people is really the task at hand. We're just trying to fill in a puzzle that people are going to fill in. And so you want kind of good faith actors with training in politics and statistics doing this work.
Well, where's the pressure coming from to get results quickly? I mean, are you really getting it from the audience, or is it from the politicians and the parties or other people in the media?
I have to say, so I've been doing this since 2016, and I can't speak from personal experience, but I do feel like from people I've talked to and what I've read, the pressure to be fast with projections was much greater before. I really think the main incentive and the main pressure on us is to be right. And we've never made a projection and retracted it. since I've been at CBS, and that's really important, especially in the environment we're in.
Right.
Election administrators did such an admirable job this cycle, a professional job in a really tough environment. We're holding ourselves to really high standards. So I would say the main pressures I feel are, number one, to be right, even if that means not being first, and number two, to explain and illuminate and not just focus on a top-line result or who won, but to teach people something about their citizens, the electorate, how people think about politics, what people really care about.
I think naturally people are impatient. You know, if you watch the sitcom Parks and Recreation, there's the line there where, you know, Tom Haverford, the character, says, "This is America. I want it now."
Right.
And I think that's true. But again, in news media, getting it wrong is the worst, right?
Right.
So if it's late, there's this urge to be first with results to break a story with any news, but you have to be right, and that's more important than first.
So, Brianna, you have a great podcast that I love called High Turnout, Wide Margins. I'm sure everybody here has heard it, which really gets into the nitty-gritty of how elections are run. And it's just the kind of information that I think we've been talking about that is good to get out to the public. How effective do you think that podcast is? Are you really able to kind of reach the audience that needs to be reached? And do you have sort of suggestions for, looking forward, how maybe you might be able to expand, this technique or other techniques to communicate with the public?
Yeah, I think for one thing, we started out as very kind of insular. We wanted to reach election officials. That's still, I think, our target and main audience, and that's who normally listens to it. That's what we create the content for. But I think one of the lessons that we've learned is that there are other people that are listening to it. There are members of the public that are listening to it and appreciate getting to know more of the detail-oriented things that we, as election officials, just assumed were too boring or too nerdy for people to listen to. And so that's been really great. And it has, I think, informed a lot of our decisions about what kind of interviews we want to do and who we want to talk to. But the other thing that I think we've had a pretty good impact on is almost like a version of media training for local election officials. I think that we end up kind of serving as a soft landing for maybe people's first interviews or their first real candid interviews about the ways that their offices work. And we often will have people that are kind of nervous and don't know exactly what kind of questions we're going to ask, and neither do we because we don't script it. But we try to put people at ease and have these conversations, and then I think they start to see that people do appreciate hearing more about what they're doing and how they're doing it and what challenges they have or what they're looking forward to most. And we've also tried to kind of get them in the mindset of talking more about what you're doing, and informing people about what you're doing is an important part of your job. It wasn't in the past. It didn't necessarily even need to be in the past. But now, because we have so many questions, because you get so much, selfishly, you get a lot of good return from putting yourself out there and putting the office out there because people want to engage more about it. And we've seen really wonderful things that other election offices have done, like Civics 101 and bringing people into the office and things like that. And we can highlight those on the podcast and show people that it's not the scary thing, that it's not something that they need to hide from, and they can engage with their local journalism or even national journalism, and it increases their confidence too. So I think that's our contribution, I guess, to the news world of elections, even though mostly we, I think, consider ourselves news for other election officials.
Yeah, and it's great because one of the biggest shocks to me when after I retired from NPR and started working with election officials, was they would come to me and they'd say, "So what does the media want?" like that it was a big, I'm like, well, they just want to get the information out there. They want to help, they basically want to do the same thing you want to do, which is inform the public accurately about what's going on. And, that there was this kind of distrust on both sides. But I think that that's one of the things that actually has improved substantially, basically since 2020. You might disagree with me, but I mean, I'm curious if you feel like that the relationship has gotten better with election officials because of this kind of recognition of a shared goal in accurately informing the public. And then, so I'd like to get your response on that, but also just kind of going forward, what do you think needs to be done to make it even better? I mean, we, as Charles showed, there's increased confidence in the results. Is that just because what the results are, or did some of these things that have been done as far as communicating with the public have an impact?
Well, with all the misinformation and disinformation out there, transparency always, that's what the news organizations always want, more transparency. And as far as relationship with election officials, I guess it depends on who you are, right, and what level of government you are with working with anyone in government or politics. Of course, the past several years being a reporter, you're attacked publicly a lot more than in previous years. So that's a big change, just the constant questioning. But it's even more of an emphasis of our need to be transparent about what we do as news organizations too, and how we do it, and parsing things out the way we were talking about explainers. And where maybe before that was a subhead section in a story, or it was a sentence or a paragraph, 10, 20 years ago, writing about an election, you break that out into something else, because SEO is something that we use too, and we know that's what people are asking questions about and want to learn about, and that you can present this in a different way, whether it's in a story that somebody reads, or it's a podcast or social media, or Instagram, or however we explain that to people. So yeah, transparency always in everything, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. I have noticed in my time at CBS over 8 years, I think an increase in journalists' interest and understanding of how elections are run, how votes are tabulated, how my desk does what we do at making estimates and projecting races. I do think 2020 might have been a bit of a catalyst with all the changes therein, and in learning about this topic. I think we probably still have a lot more work to do, and maybe there's still a bit of a gap that we can help close between groups that have these common goals and interests, people who are running elections and people reporting on them. In part, I spent my opening remarks talking about the data sources we're looking at, in part to kind of help illuminate what's helpful for us to do what we need to do. And I think a lot of that information is out there. And so, in no small part because of events like this and other kind of forums where people from my world, journalists and election officials, can connect, I think we need to keep talking, and I would be open to hearing what folks think we in the media can do better in terms of communicating this stuff to the public.
So, Kara, do you get a lot of feedback from, especially election officials, about the way you are covering things?
I don't get that much, but that's in part because we need to seek it out more.
Right.
A lot of the times, maybe it's a little bit more one way. We're asking questions. When do you think you might know this? When will we learn, this from County X?
Right.
But no, it's on us to solicit that feedback, and so I would love to hear more.
I was going to say Karen Brinson Bell is in the other event. Otherwise, I could ask her for North Carolina.
Right.
I always say whenever
we should have had the two of you up here.
Yeah, too much information is better than not enough. And if you have something where you want to get you're talking about putting out press releases, and that someone might find it later, or election night, or it's on our website or something like that. So put all those details out there. We actually do want it, because it saves time of the call, the email of like, why isn't this out here? It's for the public to find. It's for the press to find. And too much information is always better than not enough. Even if it doesn't end up in a story or whatever, that's fine. But at least you have that, and it kind of informs your reporting, I think.
Yeah, and I always try and tell election officials or other people that I work with that, if you have an issue with the way something has been covered or they made a mistake, you should tell them.
Yeah.
Talk to them, because often it's an innocent mistake. Sometimes election officials think, oh, well, this is just a reporter who's got an axe to grind or something. But a lot of times it's just, you reporters are overworked and under-resourced, just like a lot of election officials.
Yep.
So sometimes it's just picking up the phone and say, hey, you really got that wrong. This is, maybe we want to come in and we can talk about it. Brianna, what do you think? Like, going forward, what are some of the gaps that you think need to be filled as far as working with the media and informing the public?
I think, since we're the government, we're a government department, and accountability from journalism is still very important. I think that tension needs to exist, but it is not mutually exclusive with collaboration. And I think that that's not something that's been internalized by every election office, not necessarily. It's one of the things that I take really seriously when I have student journalists in my office, is to over-explain things, show them a bunch of information and data, and invite them in, so that regardless of whoever else they talk to, they know that we are a source that they can reliably get information from. So if they have a question, we're willing to give them the answer for things. And even if they write something about a mistake that we make or some negative connotation to something, I can trust that they're going to put it out in good faith with good information. And I think oftentimes, with so many news deserts in a lot of our smaller counties where they don't get to build those relationships, and so they often have more distrust because they're talking to people that don't live in their community, because their closest newspaper may be 2 counties over, and so they have no interest in building those relationships. So they often feel like they're more interested in gotcha moments and things like that, or not reporting everything correctly. It is hard to build those relationships, and it's still worth it to try to. I think both can be true, but in order to make sure that the accountability comes with collaboration, you have to actually talk to each other. So the more that we can get local journalists and election officials together, I think the better we're going to be in informing the public and increasing confidence.
And of course, one challenge is that as much as there's turnover in election offices, you have turnovers in the media. So the people who covered 2024 or 2020 are probably not going to be the people who are covering the voting in 2026 or 2028. So you have to sort of start all over again. But I think it's clearly is worth it. Are there any kind of we only have a few seconds left. Any closing words about looking into the future, if you think things are going in the right direction in terms of coverage?
I'd say, just as a reporter, it's I'm listening as a reporter, even though I'm the speaker. But this has just been really helpful, I feel like, and hearing from what you were saying about letting people know, any mistakes that we make are very public. Imagine every mistake you ever made at work, and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people know you're the one that did it. And we put it out there, and you have to own it. We fill out a form about, why did you make this mistake? It's we don't want to. So if there is anything that you see, let us know. We want to make sure that we have the most accurate information. And really, the technology I mentioned with metrics is as news organizations, we've learned a lot more about what people are interested in and want things explained, which is great news to elections focus people, because then you guys have the information.
We're sort of out of time, but any quick?
I would echo that. I'm here to connect with folks. If there's part of that jigsaw puzzle you think we're missing, please come talk to me.
And I would just encourage election officials to keep sharing your story. People are interested in it, even if it doesn't seem like it. You may not think that it's worth talking about how you do a certain thing in the office or how you got into elections in the first place, but people really do care. And it's fun too.
Well, thank you very much.